We're going.
Okay, so tonight we're going to look at Galatians chapter 5. I think we're going to spend probably at least 2, if not 3 lessons on chapter 5. Chapter 5 deals with our freedom, or our Christian liberty as we know it. And we're going to read the whole chapter, starting at verse 1, ending at verse 26. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if ye be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to the whole law. Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by the law, ye are fallen from grace. For we, through the Spirit, wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. For in Jesus Christ neither circumcision availeth anything, nor uncircumcision, but faith which works by love. Ye did run well, who did hinder you that you should not obey the truth. This persuasion cometh not of him that calleth you. A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. I have confidence in you through the Lord that ye will be none otherwise minded, but he that troubleth you shall bear his judgment, whosoever he be. And I, brethren, if I yet preach circumcision, why do I yet suffer persecution? Then is the offense of the cross ceased. I would they were even cut off, which trouble you. For, brethren, you have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But if ye bite and devour one another, take heed that you be not consumed one of another. This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary the one to the other, so that you cannot do the things that you would. But if you be led of the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like, of the which I tell you before, as I have told you in time past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. And they that are Christ's have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Let us not be desirous of vainglory, provoking one another, envying one another. Okay, we will stop there in the reading of God's Word. And I would say probably the verse of focus would be verse 13. Because we're going to talk about freedom today, the freedom that we have in Christ. Where he says, Don't use your liberty as an occasion to satisfy the flesh, but use it to serve one another. And so I want to start off with a little example here. I think we can all relate to this in some way or another. Most young people, when they turn 18, a lot of them go off to college or some other trade school. Whatever the case may be, when you lived at home, you probably had these things called rules. And it seems that no matter how old you are, if you lived at home, you lived under certain conditions and rules enforced by the parents. One day, though, many young people will, or they either have or one day will be packing the car and will arrive at a university, and there most likely you're going to have more freedom than what you did at home. Depending on the school, if it's particularly a secular university, there's really nobody, or at least very few people, who are going to tell you to, when you have to go to bed, when you have to get up, and maybe, depending on the school, you could decide how many classes to attend or how many to skip. All the rules and restrictions that were once placed on the minor are now no longer in place. They now have freedom. The question is, how do you use that freedom? Do you use the freedom to party and have a great time? Or do you use the freedom to pursue the best possible education? Or do you fall somewhere in the middle? Freedom from rules is only one side of the picture. You have to ask yourself not just what you're free from, but what you're free to do on the other side of that freedom. So this evening, that's exactly the issue that we're going to look at. It's not just an issue for university students, it's an issue for every single person, regardless of the age, whether they're 18 or 50. So last month or so, we've been looking at the book of Galatians. These are not my words, but I've heard some people refer to Galatians as the Magna Carta of the Christian life. It says that we're free. We're no longer obligated to keep the law in order to be accepted by God. We are set free from keeping the law as a means of salvation. We do not have to add anything to what Jesus has done in order to be accepted by God. Jesus has paid the entire price. And just going back to what Brock said, it's, yes, we no longer have somebody keeping track of how many times we attend church. There's no obligation, or we come to church to grow. So here's a problem and an issue of debate. The problem is this: if we don't have to obey the law in order to be accepted by God, does that mean we can live any way we want? If it's Jesus plus nothing equals acceptance with God, then what's to stop us from living a life of debauchery and evil? If we're not under the law, what should guide our conduct? That's the question we're going to try to answer this evening in this passage. So, there are three basic points that I want to look at. I don't know if we'll get through all of them tonight, but first I want to show what true freedom is not. Let's look at what true freedom is not. Next, we will look at what true freedom is, and then what we can do with that knowledge. So, looking at what freedom is not, and a good example from my own experience, about 30 years ago, I went on my first missions trip at the age of 19. I went to the country of Malawi. I've told a number of you this in the past. And we see a real good example of freedom, and also when you talk of true freedom, you're talking of principled freedom, that there's also protections involved with this freedom. The leader of that country, his name was Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda. He was appointed Prime Minister of Malawi in 1964 and remained in power until 1994. And you probably, if you're a thinking person, can kind of see where this is going. It sounds somewhat like a dictatorship, because later he would appoint himself president for life. That right there pretty much says dictator, but often the world doesn't really look at the whole picture here. The question is not whether he's a dictator, but what kind of a dictator. The word dictator doesn't necessarily always equal Satanist. It doesn't always mean that the moment you say dictator, people think of people like Adolf Hitler. And you have to consider the culture of Africa in general. Yes, you'll find it's backwards. But this man actually, as far as African standards go, he was a big supporter of women's rights. He improved the country's infrastructure. He maintained a good educational system relative to other African countries. And this is what we saw and we heard from the people that lived there. Even Wikipedia said this. Of course, when we were there, we saw a little more detail, though, about this. He set up several Western academies in the country in which he would hire only Western teachers, European, Australian, American, Canadian, you name it. All the classes, of course, were in English. And basically what he would do is go to each district and take the top boy and girl and put them into the school on a kind of a scholarship basis. So really, it looked like he was pretty invested in his people, and that's saying a lot when you consider many of the countries in Africa, because oftentimes many of them, when given money from Western countries just for the money, he really did not do that. And going back to this article that I read, and this was in Wikipedia after they said, let me see, I'll go back to, all right, maintained a good educational system relative to other countries. But of course, here comes the conjunction, but. It says he also presided over one of the most oppressive regimes in Africa. I had to do a double take there because I thought did I mistakenly go to an article about Rwanda or Sudan or Zaire, countries who had decades of problems and civil wars? Eventually, he would be forced out of office in '94. He died about 3 years later at the age of 99. So he lived a long life. And another thing I failed to mention was, too, he had a Presbyterian background. He also was a medical doctor, which goes to show you the intelligence of the man. And he was educated in both the UK and the United States. But he did not marry, so he really had no successor or anyone after. So he was kind of, once he started to get up there in age, he was kind of an easy target to get out of office. So after he was ousted, there was a coup basically, and civil war for a time. But all the West was saying, you would have thought this guy was like the leader of Sudan. They created such a monster here, and they were saying, the country would be headed in a more free and democratic direction. Well, my parents went back to the country shortly after he was out of office, and just a few years, and my parents were just saying how the infrastructure was in horrible shape. There were big potholes in the roads, which I know from the time I was there, I was impressed with how the roads were, considering this was a third world country. There was hardly a pothole in the road the time that I was there. You could also walk the streets at night. I remember as a naive 19-year-old, I went for a walk out in the town, and it was as quiet as could be, and there was a policeman just about on every block. And the policeman, I'm sure I stuck out like a sore thumb, but the policeman would come up and talk to me. Which country are you from? I mean, they were really friendly and asking me all kinds of questions about America and things like that. So you had some law and order. You were actually safe to go out at night. But when my parents came afterwards, they couldn't go 1 block without taking a taxi, and it's still like that to this day. So it really forces one to think, what is freedom all about? And another time, my parents took one of their students with them over, and he would have probably been maybe in his mid-20s at the time. And they were walking down the street of Blantyre, which is like the largest city in Malawi, but not the capital, but probably their metropolitan type city. And this random car pulls up beside where my parents and this young man is walking, and a guy jumps out of the car and goes up to my friend, shakes his hand and says, "How are you?" And my friend says, right, being polite, says, "I'm fine, how are you?" And this African man says to my friend, he says, "I'm great, because I don't have to listen to you anymore." And so I guess my parents too were as shocked as he was, because I didn't know my friend had that much power, especially living all the way in America. But I mean, that was in that man's eyes, that was freedom to him. But I really think, though, when it comes down to because with this so-called new freedom, you had all these available, moral activities at your fingertips, and I just think that those people jump for joy and say, now we have freedom. So, to make a long story short, that is not freedom. And so some people reading Galatians here think that what Paul is talking about here, we're not under the law, so now we have the freedom to do whatever we'd like. Paul knows that this is what some are going to think he's saying, so in this passage he makes it clear. He says in verse 13, "For you were called to freedom, or liberty. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." In verse 19 to 21, he makes it even clearer. This is what freedom is not about, he writes. In verses 19 to 21, he makes it even clearer. He says, "Now the works of the flesh are evident." And this is where he basically gives the list. Sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, witchcraft, jealousy, fits of anger. Whoever does these will not inherit the kingdom of God. So, here's basically what he's saying is, here's what the Christian life is not about. The Christian life is not about keeping the law. It's not about keeping a series of rules. In chapter 2, verse 16, he says, "By the works of the law no one will be justified." Later on in chapter 3, verse 10, he says, "All who rely on the works of the law are under a curse." Verse 3 of this chapter 5, he says that keeping part of the law obligates you to keep the whole law. So the Christian life isn't about keeping the law. It doesn't work. Nobody is good enough. It's a losing proposition. The message of the Bible isn't that you should be good and God will accept you. That, of course, is unbiblical, heretical, and ultimately really a satanic message. I mean, that's the way of the rich young ruler. What can I do? Keyword, I. And of course, Jesus knows his heart, and he throws the whole law at him. Sell all your goods and give to the poor. So, another example that I saw when I was researching and looking for ideas for the sermon here, a word that we don't talk about a lot, and I wish this word came up more in civics class. It's the word license. And the Oxford English Dictionary defined it this way. Before I tell you what it said, I mean, license, to put it in a nutshell, license means